course, Clinton's situation and Trump's have important differences. Clinton was in office and Trump is not. Trump's case hinges on an NDA, and Clinton's was more about DNA. One involved a naive, young ingenue who had genuine feelings. The other, an older, more, to say the least, sexually experienced bottle blonde with big tits. But there are also important similarities. Monica was an intern, and Stormy wanted to be an apprentice. Neither wife could stand to hold their husband's hand. And both men claimed they lied to protect the person they really loved. In Clinton's case, Hillary, and in Trump's case, him. But
good morning. It's Tuesday, Ayn Rand Tuesday, October the 24th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Hugh Hewitt, Maria-Bartiromo, IDF, My Take, Rules for Radical Conservatives, No Free Lunch, Rules for Patriots, Rules for Retrogrades, Larry Kudlow, ron-desantis, and Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Employer substitution of higher skilled for lower skilled workers is not the only effect of the minimum wage laws. It also gives employers an economic incentive to make other changes. Substitute machines for labor, change production techniques, relocate overseas, and eliminate certain jobs altogether. The substitution of automatic dishwashers for hand washing and automatic tomato picking machines for manual pickers are examples of the substitution of machines for labor in response to higher wages. Walter Williams. We no longer have to postulate as to whether or not this theory from Williams is true. It always was self-evident logically. Reality has seen it play out in spades.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
The Cold Civil War. Despite all the evidence of the past several decades, you still have not grasped one simple fact. That just about a century after the last one ended, we engaged in a great civil war. One that will determine the kind of country we and our descendants shall henceforth live in for at least the next 100 years, and hopefully 1,000. Since there hasn't been much shooting, so far, some call the struggle we are now involved in the culture wars. But I have another better name for it. The Cold Civil War. In many ways, this new civil war is really an intra-generational struggle. The war of the baby boomers. America's largest generation, the famous pig and the python, has affected everything it's touched. From the schools of the 1950s, not enough of them, through the colleges of the 1960s. Changed utterly. Through the political movements of the 1970s and 1980s, revolution and counter-revolution, and into the present, where the war is still being waged. For the dirty little secret is that all those fresh-faced kids crammed together in public school classrooms have hated each other almost from the moment they first drew breath, and realized that they were to be locked in lifelong mortal competition with the dozens, hundreds, thousands, millions of other kids their same age. From their first moment of self-consciousness, they were aware that they would have to fight for everything they got. For the love of their parents, for a desk in the classrooms, for a place in the elite colleges, for a job, for a title, for money, for everything. It was back then, shoulder to shoulder in those crowded, stinky classrooms, benighted places where there was scarcely a grief counselor to be seen, where attention deficit disorder and the whole host of other imaginary diseases we have since inflicted on you had not yet been invented. Any kid claiming ADD would have been laughed at, and in Catholic school, probably slapped upside the head by the nuns, and where the idea of filing a lawsuit on just about any pretext would have been considered trashy, that our respective sides developed our deep antipathy for one another. My crew was resentful that we had to share space, not only in the classroom, but on the planet, with inexplicably happy alien beings like you, who at best ignored us as you got on with your lives in pursuit of the chimerical American dream, or worse, treated us with contempt as we whined, moaned, bitched, and complained about the awful unfairness of life and the vast evil all around us, and all that jazz. Just because you happened to be the so-called majority at the time didn't mean we couldn't start planning ways to take you down, to change things, to effect a fundamental transformation of your society, which, in case you haven't noticed, is now ours. You admired strength, resolve, and purposefulness. We were stuck with weakness and indecision. You saw the world as something to be conquered. We saw the world as a hostile force needing to be appeased. You dealt with life head on, never complaining and never explaining. We ran home and told our mommies. You cheered when macho Neanderthals like John Wayne or Steve McQueen kicked some bad guy's butt, and swelled with pride at that whole faked moon landing charade, while we ogled Jane Fonda as Barbarella atop that anti-aircraft gun in Hanoi, and rolled around naked in the mud at Woodstock. Think of us as Cain to your Abel, hating you from practically the moment you were born, hating you for your excellence and your unabashed pursuit thereof, while we were the ugly stepchildren. Well, Cinderfella, how do you like us now? Today, we are cock of the walk, king of the world, all our vices made virtues, and all us sinners saints. While you were out trying to make your way in the world, earning a living, being responsible, raising a family, paying your taxes, we infiltrated your every institution. The schools, the law, Hollywood, the culture, the government. We learned to train your own weapons upon you, and while you weren't looking, we shot you in the back with them, metaphorically speaking, and sometimes literally. The Cold Civil War, in its early stages, was marked by repeated clashes between the visionaries among the baby boomer youth. My dad, the sainted Che Kahane, was of course one of them, and their parents. Between students and the pigs. Between the free speech movement of Mario Savio and the other Berkeley protesters, and the university deans and presidents, who at first resisted them, but quickly and cravenly capitulated to hordes of unwashed Goliards. And at Cornell in 1969, to an actual armed takeover of the school's Willard Straight Hall on, fittingly, Parents' Weekend by gun-toting black students. Heck, we, and I'm talking movement here, since I had yet to make my debut and missed out on the whole thing, even got our heads proudly bashed in on the streets of Chicago during the 1968 Democratic Convention. Those were the heady early days, marked by the left's generational blitzkrieg against an unprepared and astonished establishment. To hear my dad tell it, our side couldn't believe how easy it was. I mean, here we were, ready to almost lay down our lives for what we believed in. And what we believed in was basically nothing, disguised as protest. We were the bastard idiot children of Rousseau, as filtered through the nihilists of the 19th century. No wonder we all read the Russians in those days, for Dostoevsky spoke to our suffering souls as did no other 19th century novelist. Certainly not the overrated bourgeois Dickens, or the impenetrable Thomas Mann, seething with rage against the Burroughs soft machine, but otherwise pretty much clueless as to what exactly we were protesting. Except, of course, the draft. "Hell no, we won't go," was our ultra-patriotic battle cry. We sure knew what that was about. And yet, we rolled through our parents' and grandparents' generation like the panzers through Poland. In retrospect, it's almost tempting to feel sorry for them. They capitulated so quickly and so completely, especially the academics, who made the French in 1940 look like the heroic Warsaw ghetto fighters under Anilowitz in 1943. That was the moment when we realized that the universities, far from being instruments of the oppressor, were actually ours for the taking, and a natural nesting place for the long term, pretty much in perpetuity. Even after we so clearly provoked Mayor Daley's coppers during the convention, and later during the days of rage, direct action was our euphemism for violence and vandalism. The Walker Report blamed it all on the fuzz and said what happened in the streets was a police riot. Can you believe that? By May 1970, what had begun on the steps of Sproul Hall at UC Berkeley just 6 years earlier was essentially over, and we had won. Alas, as is our wont, we didn't know where or when to stop. One thing you can say about us is that we just can't help ourselves, cannot control our appetites or inclinations in any way. Try as we might, animosity, snark, and rage are in us, and they've got to come out. And so it was that the cold Civil War moved to the trenches with the last battle of the shooting war, which came at Kent State in May 1970. You remember that. It was in all the papers. Shortly after Nixon, who had replaced Johnson in our eyes as the chief villain, announced the outrageous and illegal Cambodian incursion, students at the Ohio University protested and demonstrated. There were the usual brave calls to bring the war back home. On the first day of the Troubles, liquor and the late hour predictably ignited into a street riot that was finally quelled by the cops. But tempers and nerves were on edge, and so the National Guard was sent to maintain order. And the governor called the kids un-American. Unbelievable. Well, you know what happened next. Faced with insults like that, the students upped the ante, to which the Guard responded with tear gas. As Che tells it, you were nobody back then until you'd been tear gassed. And then you could get laid anywhere at any time. Never been tear gassed myself. Finally, on Monday, May 4th, a mass rally was held. The administration tried to cancel it to no avail. The Guard tried to break it up. They fired tear gas, but the wind blew it away. The cry went up, "Pigs off campus!" The kids threw rocks and empty tear gas canisters. And then the Guard fired back. Not with rocks, but with real live bullets. In 13 seconds, 67 rounds were fired. And when the shooting stopped, 4 kids lay dead. And that, my friends, was the end of the student protest movement. Sure, some of the altar-cockers on our side will tell you that's not how it was, that the movement continued, that the fight went on, and the dream never died. But that's a lot of hooey. The minute those young guardsmen turned their M1s on the crowd, and the student protesters got an ugly lesson in the first rule of protest, never throw rocks at guys with guns, that was pretty much the end of the violent prelude to our current conflict. Luckily for us, no one cares about newly declassified FBI files relating conversations among agitators planning to torch businesses in the campus ROTC headquarters and foment a riot. and credible reports of shots fired first at the guards. But after Kent State, the movement went both underground, with the heroic Weatherman bombers, shame about that townhouse in Greenwich Village, and much more effectively above ground, into the schools, the law firms, the journalism programs, the civil rights movement, the environmentalist movement, which, believe it or not, actually started in the 1970s, with the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970.
And that was first part of Chapter 5 for Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 3. No truth is off limits. We must never be ashamed to be candid. Radicals have successfully convinced many mod-cons to self-censor, insisting that some truths are too offensive to be spoken in decent society. They've thus driven the retrograde message underground, forcing us to whisper in darkness a host of medicinal truths deserving of the limpid radiance of day. Should retrogrades continue to submit to such treacherous advice, we are destined to be routed in our fight for the soul of society. We know on the highest authority that apart from being desirable for its own sake, the truth shall set mankind free. And thus it is to be pursued at all costs. If sheepish mod-cons neglect to fiercely and openly denounce the perversities that radicals are attempting to usher in, radicals will triumph by default. Darkness can only prevail when men of goodwill are made afraid to light a candle. It is of paramount importance to remember that acts of the intellect always precede acts of the will. In other words, before we act for a certain end, the intellect, consciously or not, must decide that such an end is the good, the object most worthy of our pursuit. No one sets out to achieve what he views as an inferior or bad end. Thus, in order to win the culture, we must boldly and loudly speak truth, so our fellow men can first recognize what is verily good, and subsequently firmly set their wills on achieving it. If something is true, then we have a duty to say it, so that society will be built on a foundation of rock instead of a foundation of sand. Be reminded that there is no such thing as an intrinsically hateful truth. Motive is always a deciding factor in analyzing the morality of a seemingly harsh statement. Sometimes charity and prudence dictate that one should even call his own mother fat. Perhaps she is a diabetic or has heart disease, and hearing such a hard truth will allow her to reformulate her diet and add years to her life. More important yet, perhaps she is a glutton, needing chastisement against a habituated mortal sin. Similarly, we do no one any favors when we, out of fear of being slandered as racist, sexist, jingoistic, homophobic, intolerant, or hateful, or any other empty, radical scare words, consent to hide the light of unpopular truths under a bushel basket. When we fail to acknowledge sensitive truths, e.g., that contemporary American black fatherlessness is linked with their disproportionately high crime rates, that single motherhood is ruinous for children, that unchecked immigration is undermining the fabric of American culture, that homosexual relations are vile, depraved, hateful acts, that men can't actually become women, and vice versa, we shortchange our fellow man, since we deprive him of the opportunity to reform his life to bring it into harmony with right order. Hard sayings must be shouted loudly for the benefit of all mankind. Damn the consequences. Moreover, if retrogrades band together and resolve to be undeterred in our vocalization of unpopular truths, it will be impossible for big media and big business to ostracize us. The corporate goons in human resources won't be able to fire all of us. It's impossible to effectively silence such a significant segment of the population. The story of the emperor's new clothes serves as an uncannily apropos allegory for modern man's affinity for shrinking from his duty to proclaim truth. In the fable, the emperor is duped by two shysters into purchasing imaginary clothes, so that when he gets dressed in his new attire, in reality he's naked. Despite the fact that the emperor is humiliating himself by strutting around the town square in a full state of undress, none of the emperor's men or townspeople, for fear of appearing foolish or insolent, will speak out to tell the emperor that his wardrobe is a fraud. The people uniformly tickle the emperor's ear, complimenting his splendid linens and refined sartorial taste, except one little boy out of the whole town sees the emperor and, with umbrage in his voice, exclaims, "But the emperor isn't wearing any clothes! He's naked!" In the aftermath of this one child's naive candor, the people come to their senses and soberly admit the obvious. Truly, the emperor is not wearing any clothes. The weakness of mankind is such that the majority are content to go along with a lie out of fear of blowback should they stand and fight for truth. It's a somber realization that most people are consequentialists who would rather pretend a naked emperor is dressed in fine linen rather than risk looking foolish, or worse yet, risk a stint in the dungeon. At the same time, we should take solace that a lone voice, even that of a child, bravely crying out in the wilderness, is often sufficient to call men to their senses, to call men away from mass delusion. Be the lone voice in your locale, and soon we will marshal a network of woke retrogrades, ready to turn the tides of a war we've been long losing. The only precondition for the death of the gospel is silence. Never be cowed. Always speak truth, especially when it's unpopular. Hold fast to the musings of George Washington. I hope I shall possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of all titles, the character of an honest man.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy and David Gordon. Rule 3. The only thing I can add to this is that although they said, you got to speak up and not be cowed, the reason people are cowed is because the left plays certain tricks. You say something as a conservative, and the left jumps all over you for it. And if you don't know why they're jumping all over you for it, it scares you, so that the next time you're thinking about opening your mouth, you hesitate. And then you keep hesitating, and eventually you don't ever say anything at all. Okay, so that's always the key first, is be able to recognize that they're playing tricks. Then you recognize what tricks they're playing, recognize how to defeat those tricks, and you're right back in the game. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
Chapter 11. Commandment number 10. Play offense. The great Yogi Berra said it best. Half of this game is 90% mental. The inconvenient truth is we conservatives are so used to being marginalized that we're often mentally pistol-whipped before the battle even begins. We are so desperate for cultural acceptance that we'll latch on to even the slightest homage to conservatism from a famous figure, no matter how flawed. In football, it's known as a helmet game. When one team has such a mental stronghold on its rival that the minute things don't go as planned on the field, they start collectively thinking to themselves, here we go again, anticipating the worst. When a team has reached that mental breaking point against its rival, it's time for a culture change. And that starts by hiring leaders or coaches who will challenge the status quo and get the players to believe in themselves again. I think American conservatism is in the exact place my favorite college football team was in back in 1969, when a young coach named Bo Schembechler arrived on the scene from Miami of Ohio. Michigan was built on a winning tradition, just like conservatism, but had fallen behind because the nice guy coach was getting run over by the Buckeye bully, Woody Hayes. The final game Michigan played before Schembechler arrived was against Ohio State for the Big Ten Championship in 1968, and the Wolverines lost 50-14. That's right. Despite the fact both teams were ranked in the top 5, the final score was a lopsided 50-14. In order to score 50 points, Ohio State put its starters back in the game for a 2-point conversion late in the fourth quarter. When asked afterwards why he went for 2 points to run up the score on his rival, the brash Ohio State coach said unapologetically, "Because I couldn't go for 3. Enter Bo Schembechler. Schembechler had been a Woody Hayes disciple, playing for Hayes and then serving as one of his top assistant coaches at Ohio State. Despite a successful tenure at Miami of Ohio, local media in Detroit asked the question, "Bo who?" when he was hired. The University of Michigan was the Haight-Ashbury of the Midwest in 1969, so it was a bit of a culture shock to see this conservative bull in a china shop with a crew cut arrive on campus. The first thing Schembechler did was purge his program of the soft-headed and uncommitted. That first spring practice was so tough that several players quit. Future NFL Hall of Famer Dan Deerdorf was on that team, and he told the media, "The track team runs less than us, and their coach is nicer." Schembechler was looking for players willing to do what it took to be great, not just pretty good. At a program that had been as successful as Michigan's, it's very easy for complacency to set in. Woody Hayes may have had a few faults, but complacency wasn't one of them. He was frankly hungrier than that school up north that he hated. Meanwhile, Michigan was content to rest on past laurels until Schembechler arrived. Come fall, Schembechler's first season initially got off to a bit of a rocky start, with a blowout loss at home to Missouri and a road loss to Michigan State. By the time the Wolverines hosted undefeated and top-ranked Ohio State, however, in the season finale in late November, they had gelled as a team and could clinch a Big Ten championship with an upset over the Buckeyes, who were 3-touchdown favorites. The talk all season after each Buckeye blowout is where that squad stood in the annals of college football. Analysts at the time said the only team that could beat Ohio State was the NFL's Minnesota Vikings and their famous Purple People Eaters. No one gave this ragtag bunch of Wolverines much of a chance. And why should they? They had lost by 36 points to these exact same Buckeyes 1 year ago. But by the end of that afternoon, Michigan pulled off what the pundits called the upset of the decade, beating Ohio State 24-12. Years later, when a now retired Woody Hayes reminisced at a banquet about the best team he ever had, the Hall of Fame coach said it was that 1969 team that was upset by Michigan. That win set the stage for a dominant era of Michigan football. 16 of the 21 teams Schembechler coached finished in the top 10 of the final rankings, and he won 13 Big Ten championships. Several coaches under his tutelage went on to have magnificent careers. Hall of Famers like Lloyd Carr and Don Nehlen, national champion coaches like Bill McCartney and Les Miles. Schembechler changed a complacent culture and rebuilt it on the pillars of integrity, accountability, and excellence. His leadership helped create other equally successful leaders who put their own spin on Schembechler's vision. I tell you all of this for 2 reasons. One, I might be the world's biggest Michigan fan and look for any opportunity to represent for the maize and blue, but you could care less about that. 2, because of all of this talk for our need to find another Ronald Reagan, I think what we really need are some Schembechlers. There is a fine line between tradition and nostalgia. Tradition is the assurance that you have the right ethics and institutions to be successful again based on what was done in the past, provided you have the right people in place to exploit them. Tradition spurs action and innovation to build upon a foundation of success. On the other hand, nostalgia is a paralyzing force because it tempts you to keep trying to recreate the precise conditions that led to a specific past success. Often, that specific success was a moment in time, and the attempt to repeat it creates a myopic inflation of that success to the point it stalls progress towards a new era of success. Instead of moving forward, you keep trying to go back to the good old days. Right now, we are mired in nostalgia at the expense of our tradition. We are mired in nostalgia because our entire movement has been defined by one man's success, as opposed to the timeless traditions he fought for. As a result, every sort of Republican now claims Ronald Reagan as their legacy, even the absolute worst ones that might as well be Democrats. A pretty good rule of thumb is that if everybody can claim something, then nobody can. Yes, Reagan was a gifted man, and I've used several examples of that giftedness in this book, but that giftedness doesn't matter to us if it's not used to advance the principles we hold dear. There have been gifted people throughout history that used their gifts to do wicked and awful things. Why don't we celebrate them? Because what they stood for was wrong or evil. That's why. In other words, what they stood for overshadowed their giftedness. The same should be true of Reagan's positive legacy as well. While it's a testimony to his legacy that we still play clips of Reagan to defend our values today, it's also an indictment of how stale we are. At the time I was writing this book, I just turned 40 years old. When Reagan first ran for president in 1976, I was still eating paste and my boogers. When Reagan left the White House in 1989, I was in the 10th grade. The emerging generation of conservatives/libertarians behind me, they don't remember him at all. Al Gore had yet to invent the internet. Cell phones were a handheld monstrosity for the rich. There was no direct TV. We hadn't even invented those really cool frozen yogurt places where you buy in bulk depending on the amount of toppings you have. Heck, MTV was still playing music videos back then. You know how ancient the Macarena seems now? Well, when Reagan left office, the Macarena was still 8 years away from splitting our eardrums. And we still didn't know who let the dogs out either. The distance between 1989 and now is made even longer by how quickly information is transmitted with all our technology nowadays. When Reagan left office, we were just beginning the era of the 24-hour news cycle. Now we have the 24-minute news cycle if you take out the commercials, and 140 characters or less on Twitter. Quoting Reagan to the emerging generation today is like quoting Calvin Coolidge, another great conservative, mind you, but they don't remember him either. It's time to move forward. Now notice I didn't say move on, but move forward. Moving on either means forgetting the past or casting it aside. Moving forward means honoring it and then building on it. We don't need to return to the Reagan era any more than the Democrats need to return to the era of FDR. What we need to do is take the success Reagan had and build on it while at the same time learning from his failures. That's how you move forward. And yes, Reagan had failures. He wasn't a perfect angel that tiptoed through the raindrops without getting wet. That's nostalgia talking. Back to my beloved Michigan Wolverines for a second. After a phenomenal 40-year run, the university administration decided to move on from the Schembechler era rather than move forward. So they brought in Rich Rodriguez as head coach in 2008, and in the span of just 3 years, his tenure nearly dismantled 5 decades worth of a foundation that had been built. Rodriguez lost as many Big Ten games in his 3 seasons in Ann Arbor as Michigan had lost the previous 12 seasons combined.
And that was this installment of Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
What do you think happens after you die?
I think I'm drawn into the deeper embrace of God's love. That's stating it kind of in a more poetic way. Do you know John Polkinghorne? He said, what survives after we die? So this body clearly dies and goes into the ground, but what's preserved? And he says, what Aristotle would have called the form, Polkinghorne calls it the pattern. So the pattern that's organized, there's a unity to whatever that pattern is by which all of that materiality has been kind of organized, So Polkinghorne says, I think that pattern is remembered, known by God. And so God can therefore embody me according to that pattern at a higher pitch, what we call the resurrected body. So Paul talks about a spiritual body. Body for sure, because he believes in the resurrection of Jesus. But it's not a body like ours from this world. It's a body at a higher pitch. Because the Christian hope is not for Platonic escape of soul from matter. That's never the Christian hope. It's for the resurrection of the body.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. So listening to Hugh Hewitt, he's talking about an article, it was a video actually, and a friend or somebody, an art critic or whatever he is, who lives in New York, he was relating his experience when he came back from the movies or whatever, and there was a large crowd, and they were crying out for an intifada. And so he said basically he was shocked that there was this kind of open anti-Semitism. So Hugh Hewitt, being the dumbass that he is, asked his guest, well, what do you make of this? What, are you stupid? It's simple. The left wants what they've always wanted, which is revolution. Worldwide revolution, ushering in worldwide socialist paradise. Why does the left side with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran instead of siding with Israel? Because Israel has no revolutionary potential. Zero. Okay? It's just that simple. So Hezbollah and their friends want the same things the left wants, except from a religious perspective. So the left imagines that once the Islamic revolution gets started, that the left can steer it to its logical secular conclusion. Okay, that's the idea. So that's why they support Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, because of revolution. It's just as simple as that. Back in a minute. Thank you. A little bit of Maria-Bartiromo.
Maria, good morning. You can hear in the distance outgoing Israeli fire toward Gaza continues at this hour, but we do want to start with some breaking news. 18 days into this conflict, sirens are sounding in the central part of Israel. Hamas and Islamic Jihad have maintained their ability to fire rockets into the middle of this country, despite the thousands of airstrikes that have taken place. You can see the Israeli military releasing video, 400 more strikes over the past 24 hours as they try to hit as many Hamas and Islamic Jihad cells as possible.
So again, here's some more media bias. What is the basic message here? The overall message. The overall message is that what Israel is doing and about to do is useless. That Hamas and Hezbollah are still able to fire rockets, so why bother? It's meant to be demoralizing. Again, it's one of the media's slick ways of choosing sides without appearing to choose sides. Remember, the news media's objective is not to give you news. It is to shape reality, and to do so in a transparent manner. And that's what this guy is trying to do. Back in a minute. Thank you. So I've heard on various news outlets, Hugh Hewitt and Maria-Bartiromo and Varney and company, that the Israelis are being asked to delay their military operations. And so the IDF is in now a position where they no longer control events. They started out as controlling events, but they let things get away from them because they didn't understand that the media is their enemy. All news media is their enemy, and the news media is going to try and stop them in whatever way they can. And usually the best way for them to do it is with hostages and civilians, and that's what they've succeeded in doing. Once the IDF says agrees that there's hostages, agrees that there's civilians, they no longer control events, because now they can be pressured by news media. And what's also happening is the Biden administration is now getting involved and asking the IDF to hold on their operations. So now the IDF isn't even running their own war. It's being run by Joe Biden. And again, Israel is never, ever going to win if they don't understand that the news media is not on their side, control the media, control the message, and then they can win. But as long as they allow this kind of thing to happen, it's not going to happen. They're just going to get bogged down and bogged down. The Biden administration, who's not their friend, the Biden administration doesn't like Israel any more than anyone else in the Democrat Party likes Israel. So they're going to continue to find excuses to tell the Israeli government to wait, and then there's going to be pressure on them to, since you may as well go ahead and we may as well have a ceasefire, we may as well have negotiated settlement, et cetera, and then Israel ends up losing. And then a month from now, the same thing is going to play out all over again, where there's going to be more slaughtered Jews, and it just goes on and on and on. Israel needs to get smart, get control of the media, then they can win. And that's the only way they're going to win. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Stuart-Varney's My Take.
Now this. The so-called squad has no shame. This group of far-left Democrats lies to the American people. You have to wonder how they can be in good standing in their party. They are rabidly pro-Hamas. They vigorously support an organization that terrorizes and kills Jews. They put out propaganda to influence public opinion. Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib has still not taken down her tweet accusing Israel of attacking that hospital in Gaza. That is a lie and has been thoroughly discredited. The tweet has been viewed 37 million times. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar calls for a ceasefire, as if Israel should not be allowed to pursue the terrorists. Omar wants to lock in a Hamas victory. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez charges Israel with war crimes. Where was she on October the 7th when Hamas butchered Israeli civilians? The squad and their supporters are a powerful bloc within the Democrat Party. They have deeply offended other progressives, especially Jewish progressives. Until October 7th, liberals were united behind their causes. But then Hamas committed atrocities on Jews, and there was barely a murmur from the left. Many Jewish folks feel abandoned by their former friends. It just may be that the traditional loyalty of Jewish voters to the Democrat Party is about to unwind.
So one of the things that I noticed in his little diatribe here that's interesting, again, he's trying to make it sound as though I think that he's taking a position when he really isn't. Two words are missing from this whole thing, and that is the W word, wrong, and the S word, should. And that gives him plausible deniability. If people say that he's pro-Israel, he can say, no, I'm not, because I didn't say anything that was I wasn't overtly pro-Israel. If they say that he's pro-Hamas, he can do the same thing. It's called plausible deniability. He gets credit where credit is not due. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now it's going to be Mr. Kudlow.
All right, well, we've got some breaking news. Tom Emmer, who just got a majority of the Republican conference in his effort for Speaker, has just dropped out, we are told, by our next guest, our friend, Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. Marjorie, that's a piece of high drama. I didn't know. I'm sitting up here in this little fishbowl, and we heard you telling our producers, thank you for it. Can you just quickly describe the story?
Yes, the news just broke that Tom Emmer is out of the race for Speaker of the House, and I think it's good news. I couldn't support Tom Emmer. He's a nice guy. He's someone I do like as a person, but I couldn't support him because of his voting record, Larry. We need a Speaker of the House that reflects the values and the views of Republican voters across the country, and they support President Trump, and they support his agenda, and Tom Emmer does not. His voting record, he voted against President Trump's transgender ban in the military. He voted for the Democrats' gay marriage bill that allows churches to be sued if they don't support gay marriages. He also, once had supported the voting rights of the national voting movement that was completely against what we stand for. So that we can't have that for a Speaker of the House. But I'm glad Tom has dropped out of the race, and we've got to work hard to find someone that does support President Trump and does support Republican voters across the country.
Yeah, Mr. Trump tweeted today very critical of Emmer, and so I thought that was quite interesting. Perhaps that led to Emmer's dropping out. I don't know. Marjorie, at this point, how do you handicap the whole issue? Listen, you and I have talked about this. We need a speaker. We need a Republican speaker. We need to get the investigations of all the Biden scandals going again. We need to fund Israel. We need to fund the border. We need to figure out appropriation bills. You and I have talked a lot about this. Handicap the race for me. Who is possible is going to pop up or pop down, or when can we have a speaker, Marjorie?
Well, Larry, I totally agree with you. We have to accomplish all those things. I'd like to remind everyone with a history lesson. Back in 1855, the Congress went 2 months with 133 ballots trying to elect a Speaker of the House. Maybe that's what we go through again, because I think, and I would argue, the GOP is going through a big change, and it needs to be an America First change. That's what Republican voters want, and that's what the American people want, and that's what our country needs. I think we're going to see some more names come back in. Mike Johnson was very close in this last race earlier today. We saw Byron Donalds running, but he also admitted to the conference that he had negotiated with Kevin McCarthy for himself to have an office in the Capitol. That was something that turned off our conference big time. We saw Kevin Hearn, big conservative chairman of the Republican Study Committee, was also getting votes. So we're going to have to get back in the room and see who's willing to run and be a candidate for Speaker. But I also hope that there are 8 Republicans who joined the Democrats and ousted Kevin McCarthy. They need to apologize, and we need to heal our conference in order to move forward.
All right, well, we've got some breaking news.
And that was Larry Kudlow. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Ron DeSantis.
It's not easy. You're always under siege in one way or another. But I think the spirit of saying that we lost our homeland before, we're never losing our homeland again, that's the spirit that's going to bring the people of Israel through a very trying time. And for us in Florida to be standing with them is very important. For us to be taking actions that'll actually have an impact is even more important, and I hope other states follow, and I hope the federal government follows suit and gets rid of this delusion that you can somehow play footsie with the Iranian mullahs. Put them in their place. Do not let them get any money flowing into their coffers, because you know that that's going to turn around and be used to fund terrorism against Israel and against our allies. It's not...
And that was Ron DeSantis. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand, Chapter 13.
Some such reciprocal control is characteristic of all science. Here I omit one sentence which is an unconscionable misuse of a famous statement. Continuing. The scientist who designs a cyclotron is under the control of the particles he is studying. The behavior with which a parent controls his child, either aversely or through positive reinforcement, is shaped and maintained by the child's responses. A psychotherapist changes the behavior of his patient in ways which have been shaped and maintained by his success in changing that behavior. A government or religion prescribes and imposes sanctions selected by their effectiveness in controlling citizen or communicant. An employer induces his employees to work industriously and carefully with wage systems determined by their effects on behavior. The classroom practices of the teacher are shaped and maintained by the effects on his students. In a very real sense, then, the slave controls the slave driver, the child, the parent, the patient, the therapist, the citizen, the government, the communicant, the priest, the employee, the employer, and the student, the teacher. Page 169. To this I shall add just one more example. The victim controls the torturer. Because if the victim screams very loudly at a particular method of torture, this is the method the torturer will select to use. The above quotation is sufficient to convey the book's intellectual stature, the logic of its arguments, and the validity of its thesis. As far as one can judge the book's purpose, the establishment of a dictatorship does not seem to be Mr. Skinner's personal ambition. If it were, he would have been more clever about it. His goal seems to be, 1, to clear the way for a dictatorship by eliminating its enemies, and 2, to see how much he can get away with. The book's motive power is hatred of man's mind and virtue, with everything they entail: reason, achievement, independence, enjoyment, moral pride, self-esteem. So intense and consuming a hatred that it consumes itself. And what we read is only its gray ashes, with feeble, snickering obscenities, such as the title, as a few last smoking, stinking coals. To destroy autonomous man, to strike at him, to punch, to stab, to jab, and if all else fails, to spit at him, is the book's apparent purpose. And it is precisely the long-range cultural consequences that the author does not seem to give a damn about. The passages dealing with the global state are so rambling, incoherent, and diffuse that they sound not like a plan, but like a daydream. The kind of daydream Mr. Skinner apparently finds reinforcing. But he remains unoriginal even in his fantasy. Borrowing Plato's notion of a philosopher king, Mr. Skinner fancies a world ruled by a psychologist king in terms which sound as if a small-time manipulator were tempted by the image of a big shot. If only we would abolish autonomous man, Mr. Skinner declares with a kind of growing wistfulness, we would be able to turn from the miraculous to the natural, from the inaccessible to the manipulable. Page 201. This, I submit, is the secret behind the book, and behind the modern intellectual's response to it. In Les Miserables, describing the development of an independent young man, Victor Hugo wrote, "And he blesses God for having given him these two riches, which many of the rich are lacking: work, which gives him freedom, and thought, which gives him dignity." I doubt that B.F. Skinner ever did or could read Victor Hugo. He would know what it's all about. But it is not a mere coincidence that made him choose the title of his book. Victor Hugo knew the two essentials that man's life requires. B.F. Skinner knows the two essentials that have to be destroyed if man qua man is to be destroyed. The response. The attention lavished on Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner and his new book has been nothing short of remarkable, states the New York Times Book Review, October 24th, 1971, in a special box on its front page. After citing a long list of Mr. Skinner's press interviews and television appearances, the statement continues. The American Psychological Association gave him its annual award in September and hailed him as a pioneer in psychological research, leader in theory, master in technology, who has revolutionized the study of behavior in our time. A superlative scholar, scientist, teacher, and writer. Bear in mind the fact that the above testimonial was given to a theoretician whose theory consists in proclaiming that man is a mindless automaton, to a technologist whose technology consists in urging people to accept totalitarian control, to a scholar who substitutes the oldest of old wives' tales for a knowledge of philosophy, to a scientist who commits the kinds of logical fallacies for which a freshman would be flunked. It would be unfair to assume that that testimonial represents the intellectual level of the entire psychological profession. Obviously it does not, and we all know how such testimonials or resolutions or protests are put over by a special clique on a busy, confused, indifferent majority. But, which is worse, a profession that actually ascribes to that testimonial, or a profession that does not, yet permits this sort of thing to be issued in its name? I think the latter is worse. Manipulators, such as Mr. Skinner's clique, do not seek to persuade, but to put something over on people. The fact that Mr. Skinner got away with the mere title of the book, let alone its thesis, indicates that the cultural field is empty, that no serious opposition is to be expected, that anything goes. To be exact, I would say not quite anything and not quite yet, but the cultural prognosis is pretty bleak. Mr. Skinner's trial balloon has been punctured by many different people, including some able sharpshooters. But if he studies the shreds, he will notice that only buckshot was used. The book deserves no heavier ammunition. Its thesis does. With a few exceptions, the superlatives hailing the book's importance came from press agents, or blurb writers, not from reviewers. Most of the reviews were mixed or negative. As a whole, they conveyed an odd feeling. Not the violence of a storm, but the sadness of a steady drizzle, as if exhausted men were still unable to accept the evil brazenly offered to them for appraisal, but unable, without knowing why, their reasons long since forgotten, moved by some remnant of decency, as by a faint echo from a very distant past. What deserved a scream of indignation was received with a sigh. The two best, i.e., thoroughly unfavorable reviews appear in the New Republic and the New York Review of Books. The rest of them attack Mr. Skinner but concede his case. They accept him as an exponent of reason and science and seize the opportunity to damn reason and science. The review in the New Republic, October 16th, 1971, is quietly firm and civilized. Its primary target is Mr. Skinner's and behaviorism's view of man, which it describes as psychologically without a psyche. As an example of its approach, Skinner's argument goes like this. Physics used to attribute human characteristics to physical objects, such as growing more jubilant as they approached their natural places. Only when it stopped doing this did scientific progress follow. Would not scientific progress follow in psychology if we could stop attributing human characteristics to human beings? He does not naturally put it quite in those terms, but I have given the structural essence of the matter. As an example of its appraisal of other aspects, the argumentation is often sloppy, the sensibility often Philistine, the language often eccentric. As an apparent rebuke for Mr. Skinner's expression, inside man's skin, and something inside my skull is reluctant to accept the simple, unproblematic world that Skinner offers, not just because it doesn't like it, but because it thinks it all wrong for people whose skulls contain similar complex apparatus.
And that was next part of Chapter 13 from Ayn Rand, Philosophy, Who Needs It? Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.